Welcome to another episode of Not Another Yoga Class podcast / LinkedIn Live. Today we have an amazing guest. We have Lianne Weaver from Beam Development and Training, and we're going to be talking all about survival mode, which is something that we all kind of fall into at times. Periods of high stress or we have a lot going on in our lives, and maybe there's something kind of traumatic or rubbish that can kind of happen, and we just kind of deal with it. We kind of get through it. And I want to talk a little bit about how that sort of bleeds into work. And that's why we have Lianne here. So welcome, Lianne.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you for having me on.
So talk to me about survival mode. Like, how does it kind of, what does it mean in a corporate context?
Okay, so I think first of all, we need to understand a bit of the primitive response to stress to kind of understand how that plays out today. So our brains, according to neuroscientists, haven't really changed that much in about 200,000 years.
Mine hasn't.
It's pretty crazy when you think of the world that we live in and how much has changed just in our lifetime, let alone 200,000 years. But the kind of software, if you like, that we're dealing with is still pretty much the same stuff. And if you think back to ancestors, they were dealing with stressors that were a lot more physical. So a predator, running out of food, eating the wrong food, getting injured, all of those things. And so the brain basically evolved for us to deal with a stressor in front of us and treat it pretty much as a life or death situation. So if we were living thousands of years ago and we were around the campfire and we thought we heard something in the background, would trigger a stress response within us. So we would start to have an increased heart rate, breathing would change, blood pressure changes, acutely focus on what we thought the threat was. And if we looked and then a little rabbit jumped out, we would instantly kind of go, it's all okay, it's fine. Stress would then start to move through our system and we'd let it go. Or if we looked and there was something with big pointy sharp teeth, we would jump into the fight, flight, amygdala response. So really that survival response, because it was a survival scenario. Now, if you fast forward to today, thankfully, most of us don't deal with those situations on a frequent basis, but we still deal with stress on a frequent basis. So the things that stress us now are much more likely to be more emotional. So running late, fear of rejection, fear of judgment, giving a presentation, going for an interview, having bills to pay, all of those things. And those are a little bit more gray. The kind of, is it a predator or isn't it, is a lot more black and white. And so the stresses that we face, the brain will respond in the same way of believing this is a life or death situation. So you open your post and you've got an unexpected bill to pay. Your brain starts to trigger that as a threatening situation. So your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases, your breathing changes. Stress hormones start flooding your system. But now that threat might go on for days, weeks, months. Sometimes our threats go on for years. The other thing that is worth knowing is that before, our ancestors generally dealt with one stressor at a time. So you're being chased by one tiger, there's one outcome. You either survive or you're tiger lunch, right? That's pretty much it. Now we have multiple stressors. So that bill came through unexpectedly, you're running late for work, you've had an argument with your wife, your dog's been sick. All of those things cause us stress. And essentially to the brain, that's like being chased by multiple different tigers that all want to kill you. And so when we start to understand that whilst our lives have evolved a lot, the software we're using to process our lives hasn't evolved that much. It's no wonder that so many of us are now in a chronic state of stress. And what that means is we're in prolonged stress. We're in stress for longer than we should be. Now, stress isn't a bad thing. It's essential. If you didn't get stressed, you would blindly walk out in front of traffic, or you wouldn't get out of bed. We need cortisol to actually get out of bed and wake up in the morning. But when stress becomes harmful, which pretty much every study agrees, is when it's prolonged and we start to believe it's really damaging our health. So having a shot of stress because you're about to give a presentation, so you're just about to walk on stage and you have that shot of stress, and then as soon as you get into your flow, the stress starts to diminish and you get much happier, totally healthy, totally fine. Having chronic stress, so thinking about the presentation that I'm going to give in a week's time, ruminating over it, constantly replaying it, reliving it, keeps me into this chronic state of stress. And this is essentially where so many of us know that we're living much more in survival. So I'm just living to try and get over each stressor rather than enjoying the time that I'm there. The other part of that is, again, hardwired into us is if I am chronically stressed, if I believe there's a tiger chasing me, you saying, Lianne, do you want to stop and have a chat, is just going to annoy me. It's like, no, I'm being chased by a tiger, right? So when we try and distract ourselves from chronic stress, it's often really futile and makes us feel more frustrated and more stressed. And I think one of the key things really is that most of us don't understand that. We don't understand how stress is changing our behavior and making us respond and making us react. And importantly, none of us really have ever formally been taught, how do I deal with it then? So how do I cope with that? So if we look at it in terms of a workplace scenario, none of us are isolated. So I'm not just an employee. I'll also be a wife, a mother, a friend, a daughter, a sister. And all of those interactions that I've got going on will impact me as the employee. So I'm bringing all of those tigers, if you like, to work with me anyway. And then I turn on my laptop and I've got 100 emails, or I've got a manager that's not being supportive and is putting more pressure on. And what happens when we start to encounter that kind of stress is we go into that survival mode. And if we looked at the brain under an fMRI scanner when that was happening, what happens is we start to light up the limbic region, and particularly the amygdala. So that's that little almond-shaped part of the brain that is responsible for fight or flight, amongst other things. And so all of my brain energy is going into this survival place. And actually, there's not just fight or flight I can do. There's 5 responses I can do when I'm in survival mode. So if we look at it as a primitive thing, first of all, so let's imagine I'm being chased by a tiger. The first thing we will always do when we're stressed in some way or another is freeze. So that could be for a millisecond. It could be for ages. So I see the tiger, but the tiger hasn't seen me. So I freeze, and potentially the tiger just walks on by and I survive. So the freeze response can save our life. I could faint. Human beings do it a lot less. I don't know if you've ever lost an afternoon on YouTube where you search fainting goats, like other animals.
Oh, 100%. It's one of my favorite videos. Yeah, I love it.
It's so
just
cute.
Spook them.
Yeah. So they get frightened and they,
yeah,
brilliant reenactment. Exactly. They just pass out. But that's a survival mechanism, because a lot of the things that would prey on the goat aren't scavengers. So if they think the goat is dead, a lot of predators won't be that interested. Now, as human beings, if that tiger was coming for me and I fainted, potentially it's going to stop me feeling pain of it biting me, but it might make the tiger not interested. Then we've got the flight response. So I've seen the tiger. I reckon I've got time to start running before it's seen me. Flight response is a human being's preferred response to stress. So we're much more likely to want to run away. We've got much better chance of survival if we just get the heck out of there. Then we've got the fight response. So the tiger's seen me. I've seen the tiger. It's coming towards me. There's no way I can outrun it. There's no point playing dead. It's seen me. So I'm going to pick up a stick, start screaming, start trying to make myself seem big, lashing out, throwing stones, try and scare it away. And then the other F of stress is the fawn response. So we're making all of these very quick subconscious calculations. This isn't a conscious decision. That's way too slow. And we make a calculation that the threat is coming. It's bigger than me. It's stronger than me. It's faster than me. So my only defense now is to try and befriend it. So in this scenario, I perhaps start throwing sandwiches to the tiger and saying, here, kitty, kitty, right? Trying to make friends with it so it sees me as a source of food rather than the food. And all of those responses absolutely can keep us alive. But if we fast forward to today and we're not dealing with tigers that much, I'm in work and my manager says to me, Lianne, you've got to
This is what I was just drawing that parallel to. I was like, okay, so I'm at work, I've got my manager in front of me. He says something that I don't like. Suddenly I freeze.
Yep. So we freeze, but in the office, you can do. So like, let's imagine your manager you already find difficult, and then they're asking you why you haven't done something, right? So the freeze response is a normal response. You're going to freeze no matter what. So it could be while you gather your thoughts, but it could end up looking like procrastination. So you just say, oh yeah, I'll do it next. I'll do it next. I'll do it next. So the freeze response looks a lot like procrastination in the office. Yeah. The faint response is rare, right? But I have actually worked with someone who had an incredibly senior job traveling the world selling medical products. And every time she had to give a presentation, she would get to the stage and she'd pass out. Like, it happens, humans will do it. It's rare, but no one was shoving the microphone in her hand and saying she had to do the presentation anyway once she'd passed out. So it worked, right? The flight response, sort of. The flight response, your manager's not going to come to you and you just jump out your chair and sprint out of the office. So the flight response looks a lot like avoidance. Yeah. So, I forgot, I've got to go and pick up the kids. Oh, I'm not feeling so well. I need to go home, or I've got a doctor's appointment. Those kind of avoidance excuses. So the person who's phoning in sick when there's a big kind of meeting or deadline, stress response. Fight response, again, hopefully in the office, you're not going to just start smacking someone, but it's when people become really belligerent and a bit aggressive. So a little bit, why are you asking me? Why are you always picking on me? So we get that response. And then the fawn response is really interesting because I think it's one of the most commonly used, which in the office is better known as people pleasing. Yeah. So we kind of have that manager in front of us. We feel intimidated. We don't feel we can speak our truth. So we say things like, yeah, okay, I'll work till 10 o'clock. I'll stay tonight. I'll do this. I'll do that. The initial threat goes, but then we end up feeling worse and more stressed because we're sitting in that stress. So procrastinating, avoiding, aggression, people pleasing are all stress responses. They're not character traits. It's not your personality. It's how you've adapted through your lifetime to deal with something that you believe is essentially stressful.
And I can see those different responses more prevalently in different individuals that I'm thinking about right now, right? And you are right. We naturally tie those responses to their personality. Yes. We assume that's who they are. And I guess that can get really, really tricky for people. Not really only from an individual level, but I guess from the cultural perspective in the organization, it can just kind of bleed out.
Well, the other thing with stress is really interesting. So they've done studies on troops of gorillas. I hope that's water and not actually Guinness. I only saw the glass.
No, very fancy water with a lemon slice.
Okay. So, there's studies where they've looked at like troops of gorillas. And what they find is that if the alpha male gets stressed, instantly the stress levels of the rest of the troop increase. And that's very similar in the workplace. So if the leaders are stressed, and you know what it's like, Jamie, you walk into a room and you're in a good mood, but you're like, what's going on here? Instantly your stress levels go up. And so you start to feel that. So the culture really does, in terms of stress, come from the top. And the way that managers are leading, the way that they're coping with their stresses, and maybe they haven't had the self-awareness to recognize, do you know what, I'm procrastinating. This is a sign that I'm getting super stressed. that starts to kind of filter down to everyone in the organization, and people can just feel that. It's also really useful when you think of interactions you have with people. So if you have some sort of confrontation, so you've probably had a confrontation with someone who just almost stonewalls you. So they just look through you, they shut down, they don't speak. And if you're someone who wants to resolve stuff, it can be really infuriating and seem like they don't care. But that's their freeze response, right? So it's not that they don't care, it's that the stress is too big that they can't respond. You might have a conversation with someone and they just storm off. And you're like, I wanted to resolve it. And they've just stormed out of the office. That's the flight response. Aggression from the fight response. And then the fawn response is they don't ever even want the conversation. They try and change the subject and, I'll just go and make a cup of tea for everyone, or I've gone and bought cakes for people. So they're constantly on that edge
the
of
baker.
It's really
I know a
difficult.
few bakers.
Yeah. So you can kind of see that.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see how reducing, I can see the effect of these stresses if they're prevalent. And I can see the benefit in reducing as much stress as possible from an organizational level. But how do you go about educating people in a way that you've done for me? Because now that I've had this conversation, the next time I get into a scenario where I see someone freeze up and feel like they're ignoring me, or react maybe slightly kind of aggressively, which I wouldn't necessarily expect from them, I'm going to be a lot more empathetic, and I'm going to know how to, I'm going to be a little bit more prepared to deal with that situation. But how do you approach it? How does what you and Tom at Beam approach it?
Yeah, I think the actual tool that is most important is what you've already said, which is empathy. So we don't have to agree with someone to empathize. You can still think that that person's in the wrong or hasn't matched to your values or beliefs, but you can empathize that they're finding this really difficult right now. So there's kind of 6 ways that we can complete that stress cycle to get someone out of it. So running, okay, so we can't necessarily do this in the middle of a meeting, right? But running is our preferred way of dealing with stress. So if you have had a really stressful day at work and you don't want to take it home, go in for a run, go into the gym, go in dancing, go in boxing, anything that gets you to that kind of physical exhaustion will help you feel that you've got away from the stress, and then you'll be back into your rational mind rather than the irrational mind. So also the human brain, the chimp brain, right? So running is number 1, but then there's things like doing something creative. So any kind of creative activity will reduce stress. So if you've ever kind of just been doodling, or if you've got into cooking or gardening or something, you just in a totally different zone is usually how we describe it. So that is something we can bring into the workplace. We can kind of allow people that creative expression. We can give people spaces that feel more creative. Not necessarily so useful in the workplace, but certainly in our personal lives, 20-second hug. So when we hug someone for 20 seconds, we release oxytocin, instantly calms our cortisol levels, makes us feel safe, makes us feel accepted, makes us feel calm. So it changes everything. Laughing, so appropriate humor. So that is the tricky bit. Because you don't want the stressed person to think you're laughing at them, right? But
True.
If you're in a meeting and you can see they're getting stressed, you can kind of sit there and go, do you know what? This is really shit. This is really hard. We're all struggling with it, and crack a joke about it. And it kind of really, again, brings out serotonin, oxytocin, calms people down. If it's you having a good cry, so maybe taking yourself away, most of us have learned socially that we should not cry and we should suppress it. But crying, just like every other physical release, is a really important part of human behavior. And when we cry, we release some of those neurochemicals, which helps us calm and stabilize again. And breathing. So this is probably the most appropriate way to move out of chronic stress in the office. So there's 6 ways, but breathing, and that's definitely something Tom and I teach a lot about. And it sounds so simple, but essentially the first thing that will tell your brain that you're stressed is the way you're breathing. So if we were sat here right now and then all of a sudden there was a loud bang, we would go, and then we'd go into short, shallow, rapid breathing. And that tells my brain there's something wrong. So it starts to light up that limbic region and prepare the amygdala that I might have to run for my life. When that happens, many of us then will stay into what I would call dysfunctional breathing. So we stay breathing up here. It keeps us in the sympathetic nervous system, which is the accelerator part of our autonomic nervous system. So it's like, I'm ready to go. So if I breathe up here, if I mouth breathe, if I over breathe, all of those will make me more stressed than I need to be. So the simplest way of starting to bring stress levels down in a public place is to ask yourself, how am I breathing, and to change it. Simplest way of doing that is taking slow, deep breaths, really calm in through the nose, out through the nose. Don't use the mouth at all. There's a brilliant breathing technique that Huberman has kind of done a couple of studies on, which he calls the physiological sigh, which is you take, and we'll do it together. So take an inhale through the nose, another inhale through the nose, and then slow exhale through the nose.
Very calming.
Wow. So maximum of those you need is 5. You can do it when you're driving. You can do it at the desk. It just doesn't matter.
Driving is a good time to do it.
Really good time. Yeah. There's a lot of people who are in their amygdala when they're behind the wheel, for sure. So just learning basically calming, soothing techniques for you is how we get out of that chronic stress state. So breathing is the simplest way to do it.
I love it. So we've got some really practical ways to get out of that state. And also we've learned a little bit more about how to be empathetic when we notice these states that maybe are slightly out of character and we shouldn't be necessarily tying them to that person. Very valuable. We've gone way over time, but I expected it. So that's fine. I got lost. It got to about 17 minutes and I was like, oh, that's fine. Let's just keep going. There's more gold here. Yeah, it's been amazing having you on, Lianne. Can you tell us a little bit about Beam?
Yeah, so Beam are based in Cardiff in South Wales, but we work all around the world delivering wellbeing and personal development workshops. Everything from anxiety to confidence to imposter syndrome to stress to forgiveness. We do all sorts of topics. We've got more than 50 accredited courses. And we also offer organizations a package called therapeutic coaching. So we're kind of the additional support to a traditional employee assistance program, which is a whole nother conversation, I know. But it's when your employee is particularly struggling and they need therapeutic coaches. So we go in either online or in person, and we can help someone through grief, through divorce, through a confidence crisis, and we can kind of build them up again.
Amazing. Well, look, thank you so much for coming on. We're going to have to come bring you back to maybe talk about some of the other little bits and pieces that we just discussed there. But it's been great. Really, really valuable one. So thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Lianne.